and congratulations on this. Just a phenomenal performance. You just were yesterday named Actor of the Year by the Palm Springs Film Festival. I'm sure many more accolades to come. And so you have worked, as I mentioned, with Christopher Nolan on many movies, all three Dark Knights, Inception, also Dunkirk, in a supporting role. What was it like getting a phone call from him when he said, "You're the guy this time, you're the lead in this movie"?
It was a shock. It was a shock. In typical Chris fashion, there was no build-up or preamble. I just got a call. I think it was, in fact, Emma who called me, because Chris doesn't have a phone. And I put Chris on the phone, and then he said, I had genuinely zero idea. And he said, "I'm making a film about Oppenheimer. I'd like you to play Oppenheimer." And so, you just have to sit down for a moment and kind of gather your thoughts. And I knew it was a big one, but it was absolutely kind of an electrifying feeling, but also terrifying. But that's the place I always like to be when I'm making work. I don't ever want it to feel easy or safe, but this was a biggie, and I knew it was a huge responsibility, a huge amount of work. But we had 6 months, and I think that sort of all that work with Chris, because it's nearly 20 years, or I think it is 20 years since we started working together. So I think I felt that really well-established, deep trust and connection with Chris and with Emma, and so I felt kind of ready for it. And any actor in the world would want to work with Chris Nolan, not to mind playing a lead for him. So it was huge and terrifically exciting.
And it's an incredible journey that you take us on here with him, from his younger days all the way to the end there, all the different looks and challenges. But it's also a moral journey. You watch this, which I thought was the most fascinating part of it. You watch this man who's really responsible for this, and then questioning himself ultimately too, the moral problems that go with it, which I thought was exceptionally well written and played by you.
Oh, thank you. Well, I mean, the script was genuinely one of the best things I'd ever read. It was staggering, kind of in its ambition and in the scale, but also in how clearly he had plotted through the story of Oppenheimer. He had written it in the first person, which I'd never encountered before, so that was a new experience for me reading that. And like you say, these are the biggest moral dilemmas possible, the biggest drama possible, the stuff that all these characters are grappling with. So you just have to dive in. But Chris, having written it and adapted it from the book, and having lived with it so long, he has such a wonderful understanding of the story and how he wants to tell the story and how the character should be portrayed. So we worked incredibly closely from the very beginning to figure it out.
Emma, you've worked with Chris Nolan on so many of his films. This one seems a particularly different kind of challenge than you've tackled before. Am I right on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think every film that you make sort of has its own challenges, and I think that oftentimes when I read the scripts that Chris writes, I'm sort of super nervous because I'm going to, sort of thinking about what on earth this is going to be for the next couple of years, but also how on earth are we going to do these things? With this script, it was actually very different because I think that I felt like we had a handle, just with the experience that we'd had up until this point, we had a handle on how to do, to shoot in the desert. We had a handle on the sort of logistical aspects, but what I felt to be kind of much more of a challenge on this was how on earth were we going to condense this massive story into a film that people could, it's also very huge issues, deeply sort of deep moral ambiguity. How do we put a movie like that out in the summer and have people engage with that and make a film that can entertain whilst also allow people to be challenged by the ideas that are in it. So it seemed to me like a much more of a creative challenge than some of the others in some ways, or at least from my perspective, being the person that usually has to think about how on earth we're going to do things. But I think in large part due to Cillian's performance, which expresses so much, And of course, with everybody else's work that went into the film, it just somehow Chris managed to thread the needle of challenging whilst also entertaining, and sort of dealing with big issues respectfully whilst also bringing people into theatres to have an experience.
You know, you said you came out in summer, but July 21st, isn't that Chris Nolan's good luck date? I always heard, you know, and so we wouldn't think of this kind of movie then, but once again, he's right, and you know, and you saved Barbie at the same time.
It was a very exciting summer. I think, you know, for me, you know, as a theatre goer, apart from the fact that, you know, it's obviously our livelihood, but, you know, as just somebody who loves movies, it was really exciting this summer to go to the films. You know, I went to see other movies, would pop my head into our screen. Like, the theatres were packed for weeks. And it was really exciting to see audiences enjoying a sort of very diverse.
And he's always believed in theaters and large format and 70 millimeter and IMAX. Of course, this was shot with IMAX cameras, which is amazing because they're so big and everything. And it had to be, it was 3 hours, but it couldn't be 1 minute over. Is that right?
Exactly, because the IMAX platter can only carry so much volume. So they were very clear with us that it could not be any longer.
Which is, I never knew that IMAX had a limit. But
They originally, for The Dark Knight, they told us 2 hours and 2.5 hours. And then they extended to 2 hours 40. And then for Oppenheimer, they built a bracket. Yeah, it's, you know, constant innovation.
Amazing. Now, you guys here, I'm going to ask you questions here, and it's all in the service